Imagine entering a place where no limits existed, where every desire, no matter how dark, could be fulfilled without judgment, without rules, without apparent consequences. This place existed, it had a name, and to this day it carries the weight of infamy: Sodom and Gomorrah. For many, these cities were an earthly paradise, where wealth bought everything, and pleasures were accessible to those with enough gold. Feasts lasted all day, palaces overflowing with luxury, markets brimming with spices. From distant lands, there no one worried about tomorrow because the present was already a banquet of excess. But behind this veneer of prosperity lurked a dark reality. Morality simply didn't exist. The streets, which teemed with merchants by day, at night became stages for the most perverse rituals. Men and women shamelessly indulged in practices that would shock even the most tolerant cultures of the time. Children were sacrificed on pagan altars, while the people applauded as if it were a spectacle, and those without wealth were simply left to die, invisible to the eyes of the elite. The mentality was clear: if it feels good, do it. This was the unofficial motto of Sodom and Gomorrah, a hedonistic philosophy that governed every decision, from extravagant dinners to nights filled with wine and violence. Kindness was considered weakness, compassion a waste of time, and justice? It existed only for those who could buy it. Imagine yourself walking the streets at dusk. Torches begin to light, illuminating grand palaces of polished stone. The sound of flutes and drums echoes in the squares, drawing crowds to parties that don't end until sunrise. Drunken men flaunt their wealth, while servants and slaves are forced to satisfy unspeakable desires. To a foreign traveler, the first impression might be one of fascination, but upon closer inspection, one realizes that the city gleams on the outside, but rots on the inside. This explosive combination of wealth, arrogance, and depravity transformed Sodom and Gomorrah into eternal symbols of human decadence. It wasn't just the immorality of the parties or the social injustice, but the complete absence of boundaries. Nothing was sacred. Nothing was untouchable. Not human life, not faith, not the most basic values that sustain any society. And that's precisely what makes their story so shocking. We're not talking about an isolated tribe or an unimportant village. These were prosperous, strategic, and powerful cities. A true cultural and economic center of their time. But they chose to indulge in a lifestyle that seemed to promise eternal pleasure, but actually paved the way for their own destruction. And here lies the question: to what extent can a society live without rules, morals, and limits before collapsing? Can the unbridled pursuit of pleasure sustain a civilization, or will the price always come sooner or later? If you've realized by now that Sodom and Gomorrah weren't just ordinary cities but true symbols of arrogance and decadence, then do the following. Click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Every gesture of yours helps keep this mission of revealing the truth hidden behind the pages of the Bible alive. And that's not all. When you subscribe, you ensure you'll be among the first to discover the next chapters of this journey, stories that can completely change the way you view the past and even the present. In the next few minutes, you'll discover how Sodom and Gomorrah used their wealth and prosperity not to build a future, but to fuel their arrogance. And this is where the darkest chapter of this story begins: wealth that became a curse. To understand the decline of Sodom and Gomorrah, we must first understand how they became so prosperous. These cities didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were strategically located near the Dead Sea, in a fertile valley that contrasted with the surrounding arid deserts. Their fields produced golden wheat, abundant barley, succulent fruits, and vineyards that offered the region's finest wine. It was as if nature had bestowed a blessing upon this land. Trade flourished like few other places in antiquity. Caravans came from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Phoenicia, and even from distant regions of the East. What did this mean? It meant that Sodom and Gomorrah were not just ordinary cities. They were connecting points between entire civilizations. Everything passed through there: gold, silver, precious stones, the finest, fabrics, rare perfumes, exotic spices. Now imagine the scene: bustling streets, artisans displaying their work, goldsmiths selling luxurious jewelry, merchants offering hand-embroidered rugs, while the aromas of spices and freshly baked bread wafted through the air. The homes of the wealthy were veritable mansions, built of polished stone, decorated with fabrics from Egypt and mosaics brought from distant lands. In the city center, imposing palaces reflected the power of the elite, as if every stone said, "Here we are untouchable." But this abundance had a dangerous side effect: arrogance. Wealth made the inhabitants believe they were above consequences. Luxury turned into addiction. Feasts ceased to be celebrations and became ostentatious competitions. Who hosted the biggest banquet? Who had the finest bowls? Who could bring the most expensive musicians? Wine flowed like rivers, and food was served in quantities that defied all logic. Meanwhile, on the other side of the golden walls, the reality was quite different. The poor were ignored, forgotten, treated as invisible. While the elite feasted at lavish tables, people were dying of hunger just meters away. Inequality was glaring, and no one cared. On the contrary, in Sodom and Gomorrah, helping those in need was considered weakness. This contrast is what made the cities even more dangerous. Prosperity wasn't used to build a fair or balanced society. It was used to fuel greed and exploitation. Merchants tampered with weights to deceive buyers. Judges favored the wealthy in exchange for bribes. Workers were exploited to the point of exhaustion. If someone fell into debt, they could be sold into slavery to pay their bills. It was a system designed to make the powerful even more powerful and the weak mercilessly crushed. On the outside, Sodom shone like a jewel, but on the inside, it was already beginning to rot. And here lies the great irony. The inhabitants believed that this wealth would never end. They were convinced that their geographical position, their high walls and their natural abundance made them invincible. They believed they were the masters of their own destiny, but this blind trust would become their greatest mistake, because the same prosperity that lifted them to the top would be the cause of their downfall. Tell me in the comments, if you could walk the streets of Sodom at that time, what would be the first thing that would catch your attention? The markets teeming with wealth, the grand temples, or the glaring inequality? I want to see how you imagine that scene. While Sodom and Gomorrah already impressed with their luxury during the day, it was at night that their true colors revealed themselves. When the sun sank behind the mountains and torches were lit in the streets, the city transformed into a stage of excess and decadence. Imagine walking through its squares lit by torches and lanterns. The sound of flutes and drums echoed off the stone walls, while groups gathered in provocative dances. The richest homes filled with guests, and the palaces became the setting for endless parties. There were no limits. The motto was simple: if it gives you pleasure, do it. The banquets were extravagant, tables laden with exotic meats, rare fruits and spices from distant lands. Wine flowed like rivers. Servants circulated tirelessly, refilling glasses. Eating to exhaustion and drinking until one fell swoop was considered a sign of status. The more lavish the feast, the more respected the host. In the streets, troubadours and dancers entertained the people. Wealthy men paraded accompanied by male and female slaves, many of them forced to fulfill their masters' desires. Infidelity was so common that the concept of marriage had lost all value. Being faithful was mocked, commitment was ridiculed, and at the heart of the city stood the pagan temples, which became the epicenter of this unbridled life. Priests and priestesses performed lavish rituals, dedicated to deities of fertility and pleasure. But these rituals were far from spiritual celebrations. They were orgies disguised as religious ceremonies. Men and women believed that by indulging in these degrading acts, they would attract blessings for their crops and businesses. In reality, they were sinking even deeper into a spiral of depravity. Foreigners who visited Sodom were initially fascinated. Luxury vehicles, bustling markets, music and parties everywhere. But they soon realized the truth. There you were only welcome if you agreed to participate in the debauchery. Resistance meant ridicule, persecution, and often violence. The consequences of this culture were devastating. Relationships were superficial, based solely on interest and momentary desire. True love had disappeared, replaced by an insatiable desire for new experiences. Violence became increasingly common. Jealousy, betrayal, and disputes often ended in murder on the city's dark streets. The weak were exploited. Women and children especially were among the most vulnerable. Many were kidnapped and sold as human commodities, and the most frightening thing was that no one cared. Suffering had become entertainment. Sodom and Gomorrah prided themselves on having no moral rules. Pleasure was the only commandment, and any limit was seen as a prison. For their inhabitants, living intensely was the greatest virtue. But what they didn't realize was that every party, every banquet, every degrading ritual brought them ever closer to their end. Because a city may shine on the outside, it may seem like a paradise to the eyes. But when the heart of a people is completely corrupted, destruction is only a matter of time. As Sodom sank into its culture of pleasure and excess, another even darker side revealed itself: everyday violence. While the city seemed vibrant and full of life during the festivals, one only had to leave the illuminated squares and walk through dark alleys to find a hostile environment where there was no room for compassion or justice. The streets of Sodom were ruled by the law of the strongest. Anyone who dared walk alone after dark risked being attacked. Robberies, beatings, and murders were common, and the indifference was frightening. Bodies found in the morning were simply ignored, discarded as if they were trash. Human life no longer had any value. The justice system was merely an illusion. Rulers and judges were among the most corrupt in the city, always ready to favor the rich and powerful in exchange for bribes. If a wealthy man committed a crime, all he had to do was offer a generous sum and the whole thing would be forgotten. A poor man who dared ask for help or report an injustice was ridiculed and often punished for upsetting the powerful. It was a city where truth didn't matter, and justice was nothing more than a sham. For foreigners, the situation was even worse. In many ancient cultures, hospitality was considered a sacred value. But in Sodom, the opposite was true. Travelers were treated as easy prey. Some were robbed, others beaten, and many were publicly humiliated just for fun. There were reports of entire groups chasing outsiders through the streets, subjecting them to abuse and torture. The visitors' suffering was seen as entertainment. Violence was so common that it had become part of the culture. Among young people, for example, showing cruelty to the weak was considered almost a rite of passage. Empathy had completely disappeared. Someone suffering didn't generate compassion but amusement. What mattered was showing strength, instilling fear, and proving superiority. In the poor neighborhoods, the situation was even more desperate. Without private guards or influence, these residents were completely at the mercy of the chaos. Robberies occurred in broad daylight, and no one did anything to stop them. Women and children were the most vulnerable. Kidnapped, sold, or abused, they rarely received any help. In Sodom, there was no one to defend the innocent. Trade also reflected this brutality. Unscrupulous merchants tampered with weights and measures, deceiving buyers and exploiting the most humble. Debts were collected violently, and many who could not pay ended up sold into slavery. Exploitation was not only tolerated, it was encouraged as part of society's functioning. This scenario of violence and corruption was reinforced by the elite's arrogance. The rulers believed nothing could shake their position. To them, Sodom was untouchable, protected by its wealth and high walls. But this false sense of security only deepened the chaos. The city was rotten from within, corroded by greed and a lack of compassion. Most disturbingly, this brutality wasn't seen as a problem. On the contrary, it was celebrated. Savage parties often included brutal games with slaves and prisoners, used as disposable pieces in cruel shows. Human life had become a form of entertainment, something that could be destroyed without remorse. Sodom wasn't just a lawless city. It was a place where violence was part of everyday life, where justice had disappeared, and where morality no longer existed. There, each man was left to his own devices, and only the strongest, the cruelest, and the most ruthless managed to survive. This was the true face of the streets of Sodom, a scene of fear, exploitation, and brutality, where the blood of the innocent stained the cobblestones and where the life of a human being was nothing more than an insignificant detail compared to the arrogance and perversion that dominated the hearts of its inhabitants. Now, I want to hear your opinion. If you were a foreigner arriving in Sodom for the first time, would you have been impressed by the architecture and luxury? Or would you have already noticed the rot hidden behind that shiny facade? Answer below, because your perspective is important in this reflection. If life in Sodom was already marked by violence for ordinary men, for women and children, the reality was even crueler. In a society completely dominated by arrogance, greed, and unbridled pleasure, the most vulnerable were nothing more than disposable items. Women were not seen as human beings worthy of respect, but as property, instruments of pleasure, or bargaining chips. From an early age, they learned that their survival depended on their family's status or the marriage they could arrange. Love had no place in this scenario. Unions were formed for economic or political gain. For wealthier men, accumulating wives was a sign of power, as was accumulating jewels or land. And if a woman was deemed undesirable, she could be abandoned without any consequences for her husband. Widows were among the most vulnerable. Without influential family or resources of their own, they were simply forgotten by society. Many ended up on the streets, trying to survive on alms that were rarely given. This was because in Sodom, unlike other ancient cultures that viewed charity as a virtue, helping the weak was considered a waste of time. Compassion had disappeared, and cruelty was the norm. Children also suffered unimaginably. The children of the wealthy received some education, but were molded to perpetuate the same corrupt values as their parents: greed, arrogance, and exploitation. The children of the poor, however, lived in precarious conditions. Many were forced to work from an early age, subjected to brutal workdays, while others were forced to beg to avoid starvation. Even more shocking was the child trade. In Sodom, it was common for children to be sold into slavery, treated as commodities without any human value. This practice, though cruel, was accepted as natural within the logic of exploitation that sustained the city. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of childhood in Sodom was linked to pagan rituals. Many ancient cultures resorted to human sacrifice to appease gods, but in Sodom, this practice reached macabre levels. Children were offered on stone altars, burned alive as offerings to ensure abundant harvests or protection from enemies. A child's desperate cries elicited no compassion. They were drowned out by the music and chants of grotesque rituals. There, innocence was sacrificed in the name of pleasure and illusion. This disregard for life revealed the city's essence. For Sodom, human beings had no intrinsic value. Each person was measured only by their immediate usefulness. Women as instruments of pleasure or political alliances, children as commodities or offerings. The cycle of exploitation and cruelty perpetuated itself unabated. Even within families, love had disappeared. Parents abandoned children. Children despised elderly parents. Siblings betrayed siblings. The concept of community had been replaced by an individualistic logic, where each sought only their own satisfaction, even at the cost of the suffering of those closest to them. This collapse of morality transformed the city into a place devoid of dignity. The weakest, who in any society should be protected, were precisely the most oppressed. Women and children, who symbolize the continuity of life and hope, were treated as objects. There was no future in a city that denied the value of human life, and yet, to the inhabitants of Sodom, this seemed normal. The people were so immersed in their own arrogance and depravity that they no longer saw anything wrong with such practices. What should have shocked and aroused, indignation had become routine. This indifference was the greatest symptom of a society rotting from within. Thus, Sodom and Gomorrah didn't fall solely because of street violence or the corruption of their rulers. Their destruction began much earlier, the moment they completely lost the ability to love, protect, and respect life. And when a civilization reaches this point, its end is only a matter of time. If there was one trait that defined Sodom and Gomorrah more than lust and violence, it was their absolute contempt for the poor and needy. In many ancient civilizations, even those marked by injustice, there was a certain value placed on hospitality and charity. In Sodom, however, this notion simply didn't exist. Walking through the city streets was a shocking contrast. On one side, luxurious mansions where nobles and merchants feasted on exotic meats, rare spices, and imported wines. On the other, just a few meters away, the poor starved to death, ignored as if they weren't part of the same humanity. This indifference wasn't occasional, it was the very essence of Sodomite culture. The Bible makes this very clear in Ezekiel 16:49. This was the iniquity of Sodom: pride, abundance of food, and prosperity. Yet it did not help the poor and needy. This verse not only denounces immorality, but also exposes a lack of compassion. The city had plenty, but preferred to squander it on endless feasts while treating the needy as a nuisance. In Sodom, being poor was synonymous with failure. Those without wealth were ridiculed, seen as unworthy of respect or even pity. Anyone who dared beg in the public square was kicked out. Anyone who tried to seek justice was humiliated and threatened. The mentality was simple and brutal. If you don't have it, it's because you don't deserve it. Trade reflected this cruelty. Unscrupulous merchants charged exorbitant prices and falsified weights to further enrich themselves at the expense of the weak. Those unable to pay their debts were sold into slavery, reduced to mere commodities. It didn't matter if they were men, women, or even children. Poverty was an unforgivable crime in Sodom. The contempt wasn't limited to poor citizens. Foreigners who arrived in the city without possessions were also targets of exploitation and violence. While in many ancient cultures welcoming travelers was considered a sacred value, in Sodom the opposite was true. Outsiders were humiliated, looted, and often murdered. What for other peoples was hospitality, for Sodom it was an opportunity for abuse. This moral collapse eroded even family bonds. Parents abandoned children without guilt. Children despised elderly parents. Siblings betrayed siblings. The idea of community had disappeared, replaced by the logic of individual survival at any cost. Each sought only their own pleasure, even if it meant the suffering of others. And what makes this reality even more disturbing is that the inhabitants saw nothing wrong with it. Indifference had become a natural part of everyday life. There was no shame, no remorse. Selfishness was so ingrained that helping someone was considered a sign of weakness. In a society where only the strong survived, kindness had been erased from the collective memory. This disregard for the poor and needy was one of the main reasons that sealed the city's fate. Sodom fell not only because of its excesses or perversions, but also because of its inability to live by basic values such as solidarity and compassion. A city that builds its greatness on the suffering of its weakest cannot endure for long. The ruin of Sodom became an eternal reminder. No wealth, no power, and no ostentation can sustain a civilization that chooses to ignore the pain of others. When selfishness is the only law, the very foundation of society crumbles. Thus, what was seen on the streets of Sodom was not just social inequality, but a direct reflection of a profound spiritual corruption. A culture that rejected kindness was doomed to destruction. And when judgment came, neither gold nor palaces nor private armies could save them. The city that despised the poor was itself despised by fate. And here's a question for you to think about and answer. If you were in the midst of one of those endless feasts of Sodom, would you have the courage to stand up against the excesses? Or would you prefer to remain silent to avoid ridicule? Write your answer in the comments. I'd love to see who would take a stand. The last day of Sodom began like any other. The sun shone down on the luxurious palaces and bustling markets, the streets filled with merchants selling their rare spices, and the pagan temples prepared for another day of profane rituals. For the city's inhabitants, this was just another chapter in their routine of pleasures and excesses. No one imagined it would be the last. The night before, something unusual had happened. Two mysterious strangers arrived in Sodom. News spread quickly, arousing the curiosity and at the same time the perverse desire of some of the city's men. Driven by debauchery, they surrounded the house where the visitors were staying and demanded their release. This act was not an isolated deviation. It was living proof that Sodom had sunk into the deepest moral corruption. But these men were no ordinary travelers. They were angels sent with a purpose: to bring judgment. As the attackers approached, a bright light blinded them, leaving them stunned. It was the first sign that the city's time was up. At dawn, the messengers delivered a clear warning to Lot, one of the few righteous men left in Sodom. Leave here, take your family, and don't look back. This place will be destroyed. Even with the warning, there was hesitation. How could they suddenly abandon the city where they had lived for so many years? How could they accept that everything, palaces, riches, temples, homes, markets, would be reduced to ashes? But there was no time for doubt. Lot and his family hurriedly fled through the city gates, while the rest of the population continued to live as if nothing had happened. Then the sky began to change. The brilliant blue gave way to dark, heavy clouds that suddenly appeared. A suffocating silence fell over the city. The wind changed direction, bringing with it a sense of fear and estrangement. The inhabitants, uncomprehending, began to look up. It was at that moment that the first bolt of fire descended from the heavens. In a matter of seconds, a hellish storm engulfed the city. Sulfur and fire rained down, consuming everything they touched. Rich homes turned to ash in an instant. Grand temples burst into flames, and markets were devoured by fire. Men, women, and children ran desperately through the streets, seeking shelter. But there was nowhere to run. The heat was unbearable. The air was filled with smoke, ash, and screams of despair. Mansions that once symbolized wealth and ostentation were now nothing more than piles of charred ruins. The squares, the scene of parties and banquets, were covered in burned bodies. The entire city, which had so long prided itself on its supposed invincibility, was becoming a scene of absolute destruction. Neither rich nor poor nor powerful escaped. The fire made no distinction. All faced the same fate, the inevitable consequence of a life without limits, without morality, and without compassion. Sodom's arrogance had become its own downfall. Meanwhile, on the plains, Lot and his family ran, trying to escape the inferno that was consuming the city. But in the midst of their escape, his wife made a fatal mistake. Overcome by attachment to the life she was leaving behind, she looked toward Sodom. In that instant, her body hardened, transforming into a pillar of salt. It was the perfect symbol of someone whose heart still belonged to the doomed city. When the destruction ceased, what remained of Sodom and Gomorrah was nothing more than a wasteland of smoldering ash. No trace of glory, no sign of prosperity. The smell of sulfur permeated the air, and the charred ruins were all that remained of a civilization that believed itself untouchable. That day marked not only the end of two cities, but also the eternal example that no society, no matter how rich or powerful, can survive when it chooses the path of arrogance, injustice, and perversion. Sodom fell not for lack of walls or armies, but because it had destroyed its own moral foundations. The last day of Sodom became a warning etched in history. When evil becomes the law and compassion disappears, destruction is only a matter of time. If a woman or child was born in Sodom, their fate was practically sealed. There were no guarantees of protection or dignity. In a society where pleasure and power were above all human principles, the weakest were seen as mere disposable pieces in a cruel game. Women had no self-worth. From an early age, they were taught that their survival depended solely on their family's status or the marriage they could arrange. Love was not the foundation of unions. Marriages in Sodom were cold transactions, political or economic alliances, where the husband accumulated wives as if collecting wealth. What if a woman was deemed unwanted? She could be abandoned without any consequences for the man. Widows were among the most vulnerable. If they didn't have their own wealth or a powerful family to support them, they were simply forgotten, left to fend for themselves. Many ended up living on the streets, surviving on scraps and the almost non-existent pity of passing strangers. In Sodom, helping the weak was a sign of weakness. Thus, unprotected women were seen as burdens, not as human beings worthy of respect. Children did not escape this same cruel fate. The children of the wealthy had access to some form of education, but not to learn high values. They were molded to perpetuate the same vices as their parents: greed, arrogance, and contempt for the weak. The children of the poor, however, barely had the right to live as children. Many were forced from an early age into hard labor, begging or sold as slaves in markets crowded with buyers who saw them only as commodities. And most disturbing was the involvement of children in pagan rituals. In various ancient cultures, human sacrifices were performed as a way to appease gods. In Sodom, this practice reached dark levels. Children were offered alive on stone altars, burned in macabre rituals to ensure good harvests or supposed protection from enemies. A child's desperate cries were drowned out by the songs and chants of the priests, while the crowd watched without compassion. This portrait depicts a city that had completely lost its sense of humanity. Life, which should have been protected, was despised. In Sodom, the pleasure of adults was more valuable than the innocence of a child. A man's power was more valuable than a woman's dignity. There was no room for kindness, no room for love. Even within families, bonds were breaking down. Siblings betrayed siblings, parents despised children, and children abandoned their aging parents. The concept of community had disappeared, replaced by individualistic survival at any cost. Amidst so much selfishness, family ties were broken as if they meant nothing. Cruelty was so ingrained that many no longer saw anything wrong. Sacrificing children was considered normal, exploiting women was common practice, and despising the poor was practically a social law. Sodom and Gomorrah became symbols not only of immorality, but of a society where human life had no value. When we think about this, we realize that the destruction of these cities was not an arbitrary punishment. It was the natural consequence of a culture that had extinguished every spark of compassion. No civilization can survive when it treats the most vulnerable as disposable. Thus, the women and children of Sodom were the clearest reflection of a rotten society. They represented not just victims, but a mirror of what the city had become, a place where even innocence was consumed by greed, lust, and a disregard for life. Now tell me in the comments, when you imagine the violent streets of Sodom at night, do you think you would have been able to survive relying only on your own strength? Or would you believe that only divine protection could keep someone safe? Pride is often the last stage before the fall of a civilization. In Sodom and Gomorrah, this feeling was more than present. It was the foundation of the entire culture. While luxury adorned the palaces and parties fueled the feeling of absolute power, the inhabitants believed that nothing could shake their cities. For them, wealth was proof of invincibility, and moral decay was just another sign of freedom. Arrogance was evident in every sphere. Rulers believed their power would never be challenged, relying on high walls and trade alliances. The priests, covered in gold and incense, mocked any notion of divine justice, proclaiming that the gods of Sodom were satisfied with their bloody sacrifices. The rich, in their mansions, treated the poor like garbage, certain that prosperity was an acquired right, a proof of superiority. This collective feeling of untouchability was fueled daily. The squares were filled with monuments displaying the city's grandeur, the markets bustled with goods from distant lands, and the palaces were decorated with mosaics depicting scenes of victories and conquests. Nothing, absolutely nothing, seemed to indicate that the end was near, but pride is deceptive. It blinds, making us believe that tomorrow will be the same as today and that no consequences will follow. In Sodom, arrogance was not only collective but individual. Each inhabitant believed they were masters of their own lives, owing nothing to anyone. Morality, which in other societies regulated coexistence, had been replaced by the motto, "If it pleases me, then it is right." The cruelest practices were justified by the simple fact that they could be carried out. If a rich man wanted to take over a poor man's house, all he had to do was falsely accuse him of some crime. If a woman disobeyed her husband, he had the right to discard her. If a traveler entered the city without riches, he was seen as easy prey. Pride fueled a society that confused power with immunity and pleasure with freedom. Most disturbing was the mockery of the idea of judgment. Accounts indicate that when Lot, Abraham's nephew, tried to warn the inhabitants about the need for change, he was ridiculed. They laughed at the possibility of divine punishment. For them, talk of limits, justice, or compassion was a sign of weakness. The city prided itself on being free from any moral rule, unaware that this freedom was, in fact, its death sentence. Pride was also evident in the excessive reliance on wealth. Trade was prosperous, harvests were abundant, and gold circulated in large quantities. For the inhabitants, this prosperity was a sign of blessing. It didn't matter that it was obtained through exploitation and injustice. For them, the simple fact of becoming rich was proof they were on the right path. The problem is that they forgot that no civilization is sustained by gold and pleasure alone. When the moral fabric is destroyed, society, no matter how wealthy, begins to crumble from within. And perhaps this is the most frightening point. Sodom didn't fall for lack of wealth or technology. It fell because of excessive pride. Believing nothing could destroy it, the city became blind to the signs of its own decline. When the angels arrived, disguised as travelers, the people's reaction was not hospitality, but violence. They wanted to humiliate the foreigners, proving that Sodom respected no one but itself. This arrogance was the final proof that the city had surpassed all limits. The destruction came as no surprise to those who could see reality, but for the inhabitants who thought themselves invincible, the judgment was unexpected, swift, and devastating. Pride is, in essence, the refusal to learn, and Sodom, drowning in its own arrogance, refused to listen. Its downfall was inevitable, because any society that believes itself to be greater than its own morality is destined to self-destruct. The day began like any other in Sodom and Gomorrah. The sun shone down on the polished stone palaces, the markets bustled with voices vying for customers, and the smell of spices, fresh bread, and roast meat mingled in the warm air. For the residents, it was just another day of festivities, business, and pleasure. Nothing indicated that the city was about to face its final dawn. The night before, however, something unusual had happened. Two foreigners had arrived in the city. For Sodom, outsiders were seen as easy prey, targets of mockery or abuse. The news spread quickly, and soon groups of violent men began surrounding the house where the visitors were staying. They wanted to publicly humiliate them, turning their arrival into yet another spectacle of perversity. These men, however, were no ordinary travelers. They were angels sent with a mission to rescue Lot and his family and bring judgment upon the city. When the attackers tried to force their way in, an intense light blinded them. Staggering, they fell to the ground, powerless before a power they had never seen. To Sodom, this seemed like an inexplicable setback, but in truth, it was a sign that time was running out. At dawn, the angels were clear. "Leave this city, take your family, don't look back. This place will be destroyed." It was a direct order, a final act of mercy before justice. But even then, there was hesitation. How could they abandon homes, riches, memories? How could they accept that everything would be reduced to ashes in a few hours? Still, Lot took his wife and daughters and fled. Meanwhile, the inhabitants went about their daily lives. Priests prepared new rituals in pagan temples. Merchants discussed prices loudly. Nobles planned banquets for the evening. No one imagined that these would be their final hours. Pride and arrogance blinded them to the impending reality. Suddenly, the sky began to change. Heavy clouds appeared as if from nowhere, bringing a suffocating darkness into the middle of the day. The wind picked up. An eerie silence fell over the streets, and people began to look at each other in confusion. What had once been an ordinary day transformed into a foreboding scene. Then it happened. A flash of lightning split the sky, and within seconds, balls of fire and sulfur began to rain down on the city. Luxurious homes were instantly ablaze. Imposing temples, symbols of pride and idolatry, crumbled in flames. The fire spread like a storm, consuming entire streets. The heat was unbearable, the air thick with smoke, and screams of despair echoed everywhere. Men and women ran for cover, but there was nowhere to go. The city gates were ablaze. The squares became death traps, and despair filled every face. Rich or poor, masters or slaves, all now shared the same fate. The city that had long believed itself invincible was reduced to dust before the fire that fell from the sky. Lot and his family ran across the plains trying to get away. His heart was pounding, his feet were bleeding, but there was still hope. The warning was clear: don't look back. However, his wife, overcome with longing and attachment, couldn't resist. She turned to see the city in flames. Instantly, her body stiffened. In seconds, she was transformed into a pillar of salt. Her story ended along with that of the city she loved so much. When the storm subsided, what remained of Sodom and Gomorrah was nothing more than a desert of smoldering ash. No palace, no temple, no riches remained. What had once been a symbol of power and pleasure had been transformed into unrecognizable ruins. Silence replaced the noise of the festivities. The smell of sulfur hung in the air as a reminder of the judgment that had fallen. This story isn't just an ancient tale, it's a timeless warning. Sodom and Gomorrah believed themselves untouchable, but no society survives when it replaces justice with oppression, compassion with selfishness, and humility with arrogance. The last day of these cities is testament to the fact that pride always paves the way for ruin. And now that you've seen the true face of Sodom and Gomorrah, here's a thought. No amount of wealth, power, or excessive pleasure could save that society from its downfall. If you believe we still need to choose a different path today, write in the comments below, "I choose righteousness." Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, because every gesture helps this message reach more people. And remember, this was only part of the story. There are still surprising revelations you can't miss.